150,000 per day, 2.5 lakh basically. And I think that in MP there are about 40 cases a day, and now 20 the last I checked. And the UP is about 17. Now Kerala is a little more, but the point is that see the vast differential. And even Omicron doesn't seem to be making much of a dent at this time. Let's see how things happen. It seems to be mine, but we'll see. My point here is that the policy response has been different, and the policy response has been very successful. The FDI policy in India is more cautious and encouraging domestic manufacturing. The FDI policy in USA has been to ship out manufacturing jobs abroad. And the unemployment rate at this point is high, but it's not just the unemployment rate, it's the kind of jobs available for the rural population that are more the issue. That the policy is not sensible, whereas the Indian policy is more sensible. The Make in India, the domestic manufacture focus allows for, growth of all, inclusive growth. There's more sensible monetary policy. इनका interest rate तो zero हो गया, zero से नीचे ये लोग जा नहीं सकते, फंस गए. अपना कम से कम base rate 6% तो है, तो कम से कम 6% interest तो देना पड़ेगा. अब आप, if you think about a person who retires in America, his FD rate these days is 0.02%, 200%. यानी कि आप $1 million of retirement savings डालेंगे तो 1 year में आपको $200 मिलेंगे. इस basis पे आप किस retirement पे base पे rely कर सकते हैं. So the problem is that it's just catering completely to the large banks and dipping monetary policy to a point that where the rate is basically negative 2% on a real basis, which is not sensible monetary policy, right? So come se kam, at least we have a more sensible one. Our inflation is of course high, but our monetary policy is more sensible, right? So we understand the trade-offs between savings and economic growth and inflation much more, it seems to me, than the Americans do. So what am I trying to argue? My point I'm trying to argue is that going forward, including stock market growth is more likely. Okay, at least we won't have the problem that stock markets make only some people richer. If we build the stock market and we educate retail investors properly, we'll have a situation where everyone can participate in the growth of the stock market. So we won't be guilty of the notion that we're creating more cross-sectional discrepancy in economic well-being, okay? Because given a more sensible policy response to many issues, including the ones I've delineated. So what I'm saying is that for the good of the economy, given how well we've done, we should also build a very strong stock market. That's the point I'm trying to make. So just to give you 2 more summary slides, I think that basically what I'm trying to argue is that we should educate investors on how to invest responsibly and sensibly in the stock market, avoid too much speculation, and view the stock market positively. The last point I'm trying to make is for the investors, I think we should advise them to, proceed in IPO markets with caution, particularly in popular IPOs, not subscribe initially, right, overpricing. Look for solidly profitable companies with low volatility, very classic Graham and Dodd strategy, which works really well. We should pay attention to analyst revisions, and most importantly, we should trade less, but trade thoughtfully. That's from the investor side. And that, unfortunately, is all I have to say. Okay, so that's the end of my speech. So thank you very much, Dr. Dharmen, and everyone. And please proceed with the session. My speech has ended.
Thank you, Dr. Subramaniamji. It's really a great lecture. Sir, can you permit us to invite 1 or 2 questions? But if you do want it right now, or maybe afterwards, there is another speaker we have, and that is Professor Arvind Virmani ji. So if you can wait for another 20 minutes, we can ask him to deliver the lecture.
हाँ जी सर, यहाँ जरा सॉरी सर, वन स्मॉल थिंग, यहाँ जरा टाइम ज़्यादा हो रहा है, तो मैं 20-25 मिनट रुक जाता हूँ, लेकिन 12:15 मुझे जाना पड़ेगा सर, यानी कि अब से आप समझ लीजिए 35 मिनट. I'll have to leave at 35 minutes plus. 35 minutes. Is that okay with you?
Okay, sir. Then we can quickly go for this summing up, and then we can take this next lecture, because he will be going after about 30. He's here for 30 minutes only now. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. We would request you to please be with us for another 30 minutes. I hope you will spare this. And we are going to invite Professor Arvind Virmani ji. Hello, Professor Arvind Virmani ji. Hello. You are muted probably. Yeah, you are muted probably. Unmute yourself, please. Please unmute yourself. We are not still hearing you.
Hello.
Yes, now it's all right. Sir, we welcome you to the second day of our conference, and I invite you for your lecture. He has been a former Chief Economic Advisor to Government of India. Professor Arvind Virmani ji, please over to you.
Okay. Can you see my presentation heading?
Yes,
Hello?
yes. We can hear
Okay.
your voice.
So,
We can see your presentation also. Kindly.
Okay. Thank you. I would like to start by thanking Professor V.K. Malhotra for this invitation to speak at the IEA and for Professor Madan to arrange the thing. I would have liked to be present there in person, but unfortunately I'm 12 hours time difference here. But given the shortage of time, let me dive right into my talk. So what I'm going to do in the 25 minutes to 30 minutes allotted to me is give you a capsule history of the Indian economic policy and economic outcomes. So the idea is to, from the perspective of my experience, which is in research, policy analysis, and detailed policy advice to government over 20 years, to give you an idea of the link between economic policy and economic outcomes. So basically, broadly speaking, I divide the history into 5 phases, which are separable by policy themes and growth outcomes. Though the dividing line is not always clear, of course, there are multiple policies which happen, and some of them end earlier or change earlier, some later. But this is a broad theme which helps us grasp the 70-year economic history of the country. So the first phase is what I have labeled bureaucratic socialism, which was basically the policy regime which prevailed for the first 30 years from 1950 to 79. Now, people have called it Nehruvian socialism, Fabian socialism, etc. But I give this name for a particular reason. The professed goal was a mixed economy, but the reality was that over 30 years, there was a jungle of controls on every aspect of the economy, which is why I call it bureaucratic socialism. The emphasis turned from more and more from the objectives which were trying to be achieved to how to control the economy and direct it in a certain direction. So what was the economic outcome? The outcome was that the per capita GDP over this 30-year period averaged 1.3% per annum. This was touted as being much higher than the colonial period, but it was in the bottom quintile of all countries in the world. Okay, it was in the bottom 1/4 of all countries in the world, and that is how is best to judge is in comparison of what other countries could achieve during the same period. And one very surprising fact, which is often forgotten, is that poverty actually increased during this period. Despite this 1.3% annum, which was larger than in the pre-colonial period, the poverty rate actually increased. But more importantly for the future is that we are still with some of the systemic outcome was a massive increase in tax evasion and corruption. It became a systemic problem. It was not just an individual, that one individual is corrupt, somebody is not. It got embedded into the system itself. The second phase, which basically started in 1980 and went up to around 1991, was what I call selective D control. In the areas of external trade, production capacity, and prices. I don't have time to outline all the controls. I called it jungle of controls, but selectively these controls were liberalized during the decontrol phase, which was roughly from 1980 to 91, which was the decade of the 80s. And the surprising thing, it's an amazing thing which few people still have understood and analyzed. And by the way, this whole thing is based on research papers which you can see. I don't have time to go into every research paper, but the per capita GDP growth rate tripled from 1.3% average per year in the previous period, which I just talked about, to 3.9% per year, roughly. And the productivity research which we did showed that the key driver of this was capital goods import, because it allows allow productivity in firms to increase. And in the international context, which I mentioned earlier, India moved from the bottom quintile to the top quintile of the countries across the world. So just selective D control had this enormous effect on growth, and poverty began to decline again. So over this period, over the 10 years, poverty rate actually declined. However, the caution was that certain policies continued on their socialist trajectory. One of the most important of those was that the marginal income tax rate reached a surprising 95%. 95%. That means if you earned 100 rupees at the margin among the richest, only 5% you could use. And if you included the wealth tax, it actually went over 100%. So it was decontrol. It unleashed an enormous amount of entrepreneurship, despite the small amount of reforms done. The third phase is what I label as liberalization, which more people are familiar with, which is basically during the 90s, but from 91 to 2003. And here I illustrate some of the important things which were changed, which also gives you of how bad it was before. So price, production, capacity, trade, except for a few sectors like petroleum, fertilizer, and sugar, which continue to be controlled. The investment, private domestic investment was liberalized, foreign FDI was allowed in. Capital market reforms, the CCI was abolished. Foreign investment in the form of equity markets. We just heard the professor talk about the importance of equity markets. So we recognized this in the 90s and very deliberately tried to mesh the policies which were important for unleashing this productivity and growth. So FII, ECB was allowed during this period. External trade, extensive reform of QRs, tariffs, and some element of minerals reform. Why, this is again something which the younger people have not heard of, but in 1991, the highest marginal tariff rate was 300% on manufacturing goods. This was brought down to roughly 10% over this period, the most of the rates. Exchange rate, the whole controlled system went from a dual rate to a uniform rate to market driven. External trade and exchange rate were two elements of the reform which I was personally and deeply involved in. Banks, equity markets, financial sector, decontrol and regulation. Some aspects of infrastructure, moving from government monopoly by gradually allowing private investment to compete with the government thing. So new telecom policy, highways and rural roads, a big push. Electricity Act, which allowed private participation, private airports, ports, etc. So a liberalization which was fairly broad. But we will see what was still left. So this was the liberalization. And what was the outcome of this liberalization? The per capita average annual growth rate rose by about 50% to 5.5% in the 90s, and further to around 6% in 2000. So I give two rates in this connection because there were some important theoretical aspects which emerged, which were the lags in the acceleration despite major reform. One of the things we noticed in the 90s when we were deeply involved in the reforms, that the growth rate didn't immediately go up. So this concept of the J curve of growth and productivity, which you can also read it's in one of the IMF papers which we did. because of major reforms. Again, I do not have time to go into the details of what this J curve is, but it basically explains lags in productivity growth, because some sectors, because there's such huge change for sectors to mesh for different aspects of the economy, to move to this next plane or a higher plane, things get out of whack. So some some sectors productivity actually can decline for a little while. So overall, you don't see this great acceleration immediately. So that was the concept. And again, if you look at the poverty rates, the rate of decline of poverty actually accelerated during this period. So you have higher growth, you have reforms, higher growth, and faster poverty reduction. Then the period of around 10 years or so, which followed the liberalization, which the P4, which can be referred to as lost decade. I'm taking this title from a book written by a former reporter or sub-editor of the Hindu, in which the reference is actually to lost decade of reform. So reform kind of slowed down. It is not to the growth, as we will just mention here. So in 1999, we wrote a paper on second generation reforms, but all that was ignored during this decade, and primacy was given to social goals. It turns out that I happened to be the CA during this period and retired in 2009, but before I left, I had warned that reforms were critical for sustaining fast growth. But these warnings were not heeded, and partly because they were coasting along on the reforms of the 91 to 2003, which we have already mentioned. So some of the, or a large part of the benefit of those reforms came here. So it made people complacent. But those of us who had worked on reforms for decades before that had warned that it looks very comfortable. The growth rate is high, but you are really coasting on the past reforms, and you must continue the pace of reform. That advice was not heeded, and what we had then was a loss of momentum of policy reforms during this period. Fiscal credit loosening and fiscal and monetary policy loosening, which resulted in a mini BOP crisis in 2013. Now, the fiscal looseness has this effect that it can keep things buoyed for some while, but then the dangers of a crisis increase. So another aspect was the legacy credit problems. So, again, a small personal incident. The only time I went public in objecting to a government policy was because public sector banks were being forced to lend to for infrastructure investment, which was not profitable. And it turns out, in hindsight, clearly this objection, and I wrote a paper in EPW with the full permission of my boss, and this legacy credit problem, it created huge amounts of problems subsequently, which were delayed, which were not sorted out. So this leads us to a transition period, which is kind of in between, which is neither a kind of exactly lost decade and the fifth phase. And very quickly, let me go over it. I don't call it, you'll see that the next phase is what I call liberalization 2. This does not mean there were no reforms during this period of transition, but it had a mixed effect. So what was it? Why do I call it transition? Firstly, there were reform. Indian Bankruptcy Code was a major reform of the system, which had been pending for decades and decades. Monetary Policy Committee, flexible inflation targeting. I think the professor who spoke before me mentioned that the monetary management has become much better, but we went through a hiccup phase, which I will just tell you about. Goods and services tax. Again, a major constitutional change, but with limitations. Natural resource reform, sale through auction, huge reform over a long period of time. And then DBT, you heard of Aadhaar, Jandan, etc., Digital India, the steps on UPI, etc. A number of other things happened, but there were also mixed policy signals. So even though the macro issues began to be sorted out, there was a gap. So what was the problem? So we developed this concept of J curve of institutional reform. Remember what I said about the J curve of policy reform? We went on to apply that concept to institutional reform. So what does it mean in this context? So IBC, though it's a huge long-term, medium-term reform, it had short-term costs. So there is a kind of a productivity decline for a short period before you begin to see the real positive effects. Similarly, GST, a big constitutional reform, but the compromise in design resulted in the performance being much, much lower than had been predicted. I mean by the general public. We were, of course, aware and worried and did support the reform because the constitutional change was very important to get the thing going. But now we have to reform it. MPC, huge forecasting errors. This is one of the major reasons why growth slowed during this period before 2019. Forecasting errors. So the high rates, even though MPC concept is and flexible inflation targeting is a good concept, the RBI governor at that point and the MPC went to the other extreme and really forecast higher inflation than actually was warranted, and therefore over tightened the policy. So that had big negative effects on growth and so on. So slowness in solving legacy problems and all these short-term J-curve effects had a negative impact on credibility and market confidence, and GDP growth and investment actually slowed down. So that is why I call it a mixed policy. And finally, and I particularly included this issue of Make in India and protection bias. A lot of people abroad and in India talk about this, so I wanted to show you one very important graph, which is this next one. Now you see this is all based on WTO data. If you look at the top graph in blue, this is the simple average tariff rate of India, the average for the whole economy. And you will see that in 2019, right here, there was actually an increase of about 3 percentage points in the simple average tariff rate and remained there 218 and 219. And then it has come down. This is the part which has been completely mixed. And what is the reason? As the heading of this graph shows, that in fact, Make in India actually did tend to become protectionist, but the government has realized the issue, and the new Atmanirbhar Bharat program has realized that this overall broader increase in tariff rate is not a good thing for the economy. So much more focus on other things, which I will just talk about in the final phase, what we call the fifth phase of the thing. But this is very, very important to remember that the average tariffs, people abroad and in many critics of the economy are still talking as if we are up here. We are already back to the trend line of the simple average rate. This is a very important point to remember when people criticize the so-called protectionist policy of the government. So the final phase, Liberalization 2, which basically started in 2019. And I'm going to say a little bit more on this point here. So this is the most significant set of economic reforms since the 1990s. And if the commitment and spirit of reform is maintained, it could be more significant than 1990 reforms, which is why I call this Liberalization 2. What's so different about it? There is now a change in philosophy, approach, and attitude from the old communist socialist ideology to a market economy and a modern welfare democracy. Remember how we started? Phase 1, we called it Bureaucratic Socialism. Now that elements of that had survived through all these reforms we have talked about earlier. But I think now there is a fundamental change. And the key role of entrepreneurs as job creators is being recognized. This is a fundamental change in looking at entrepreneurs from a socialist perspective to a market economy perspective. Openness to information, institutional reform to complement policy reform. These are some of the changes in attitude, etc. And underlying all these, and the implication is that government looks at itself more and more not as a doer. It's not the government's business to run hotels like Ashoka Hotel, etc., but to facilitate the growth of the economy. So this attitude change is what makes this liberalization very important. But there are also details which confirms and support this. So what are the things we support? Policy. Look, if you look at the policy, is comprehensive, systematic efforts to liberalize. So we have production and service sectors, example, agriculture, space, atomic energy, BPO, work from home, drones, geo mapping, infrastructure. Many of these things, even I, sitting in 2019, couldn't have dreamed that space and atomic energy would be liberalized so quickly. So bring in private enterprise, bring in private competition. It is not that the Space Commission is being abolished for the atomic energy, but the competition is being brought in to stimulate productivity. Factor markets. This is something which we had identified in 1999, 2000, the second generation reforms, because the earlier reform didn't touch the factor markets. I have already talked about the IBC, the India Business Code. Labor codes have been reformed. Bad bank has been formed. And the third very important element, public sector reform, a fundamental reform of the public sector through all possible means. So PSC, privatization, monetization, PPP. So whatever fits the particular sector and the particular situation in which it's operating, use that, to do, not based on ideology. Remember what I said, the whole point was that socialism, bureaucratic, was based or started on the basis of ideology. Here it is pragmatism. But underlying it is one important thing, market reform, market competition is good for everybody. So institutional reform to complement policy reform. So this comprehensiveness, going systematically one by one through all the sectors, all the areas, and liberalizing, trying to introduce market competition into the system. Institutional reform, you've all heard of ease and cost of doing business, but just mention one, rules, regulation, procedure. Example, the logistics, the Gati Shakti. It sounds as if it's just a program or a dashboard, but underlying it is the concept of integration of reducing logistic costs, which in India is something like 40 to 45% greater than the average of the world. So, and finally, I won't again have much time to elaborate on this, but a modern welfare system with Indian characteristics, which I would call it, based on Aadhaar, etc. So what is likely to be the result of this? That during the current year, we are likely to come back to the old line, be about 2 to 3% higher than we were in 2019. But this doesn't mean we should rest on laurels. And I will just conclude by giving you some important policy and institutional reforms which remain to be carried out. Because the process of reform never ends, actually. Because if you, well, let me say this and then I'll conclude with the implication. So going forward, ensure growth is inclusive and sustained over decades. There are 5 items which I've identified that is not exhaustive, but just to give you a flavor of the things which are still pending. One is tax reform. We still need direct tax code. We need GST reform. I told you that the design, because of the compromises which had to be made to get the constitutional amendment passed, the design is not very good. We are not getting the full productivity benefits. The MSMEs don't have a level playing field because the GST is too complicated. So direct tax code, which affects MSMEs, which must balance the playing field with respect to corporates. Corporate taxes have been reformed. The direct taxes have not been. GST and customs. Again, labor-intensive exports by MSMEs are very, very important, not just for exports, but for creation of jobs, which propagate to the whole economy on wages and private consumption. So tax reform is my number one priority. Now, one of the reasons for raising this importance in a thing is because I find that many economists do not understand the macro. 95% of the public, you ask them about taxes, everybody is an expert on taxes. It affects my own income. I know about income tax. Everybody knows about taxes. But few understand the macroeconomic importance of taxation. So I want to leave all of you with that thought, that taxes have macro implications. It had implications on the whole economy. It's not just a personal matter, how much I pay in taxes. Very quickly, the others are modern professional regulations to balance innovation and competition. We are going to have digital economy is going to be one of the leading sectors in the next 5 years. It's very important to have modern professional regulation. Again, many economists who in their particular fields are experts don't recognize the importance of having regulations which are modern professional. Digital empowerment. This is something I would have liked to elaborate on, but I'm running out of time. As I indicated, digital empowerment can be a huge lever for inclusion. I just mentioned e-medicine, e-education, work from home. We have a recent paper called Vision 2050. For those who want to learn more about this, you may like to read that. But I think this is, again, something which is going to be a very important driver for the next 5 years. So it's important that we understand, and governments, state governments, central government, all do their best to make this happen. Ensuring job skills, e-education I mentioned in the previous point, but again, many people have a limited vision. Some people think only of the high-skilled jobs, high education. Some people only think of what will happen to the unemployed. But what you have to do is to ensure job skills from the lowest to the highest education level. So it's a very, very important topic and complicated and requires detailed attention. And this is going to be a driver not just of domestic growth, but India's position in the world. And finally, legal reform. A fair and effective criminal justice system is critical for the future. Why? Because a good criminal justice system ensures that people who disagree don't get into issues of murder, violence, and conflict. Conflict is the death of growth. So if you have a fair and effective criminal justice system, the democratic disagreements, etc., get channeled into peaceful discussion and resolution becomes much easier. If you have outbreaks of violence against each other among people, etc., it sets up a negative cycle. So the importance of legal reform. I should mention here that again, it's not that it's been recognized. In fact, the BJP manifesto for 2019 elections, the national elections, actually had this for the first time ever, the importance of legal reform. But it's very important for economists to understand that how important this is for the economy. It's not just a question of cases taking 30 years, and which I have also personal experience, but it also has economic effects. So with that, let me conclude, if as I mentioned earlier, that if these reforms continue with the spirit in which we have seen since around September 2019, over the last 2 years, then I project that a growth rate of around 7.5%, plus minus 0.5%. As a macroeconomist, I have done tons of focus and never give a point estimate. I, in fact, frankly, disagree with anybody who gives a point estimates. We must always remember there is always big uncertainty around any macro forecast. But I'm reasonably confident that over the next decade or so, we will get a growth rate of between 7 and 8%. With that, I think I've used up most of my time. Thank you for listening patiently.
Thank you, Professor Virmani ji. Inji was with us earlier. We would like to invite some questions if our participants have. So 2 or 3 questions, right, sir? Okay.
Yeah, most welcome.
Okay.
Any number.
So first of
That's what
all,
I get.
I can invite questions for Dr. Subramaniam ji. Dr. Subramaniam, sir, are you with us? Dr. Subramaniam ji, are you with us? Okay, sir. Dr. Virmani ji, any
Yeah, ji.
questions, please? Just one question. Yeah. Sir, Dr. Narial, he would like to ask one question. Dr. Narial is a former Vice Chancellor and now serving as a professor in IIT Roorkee. Dr. Narial, please.
Sir, namaskar. And it was wonderful to listen to your talk. You have had a very comprehensive coverage of the whole issue of reforms. I do have just a small comment to offer here. Despite all kinds of reforms that are being done, the technology is one thing where probably we are lagging a lot. Technological innovations are very less. R&D expenditure is too meager. And these two things, less R&D expenditure with little innovations are going to tie down our economy like anything. Do you think that government should go for some proactive measures so as to promote R&D expenditure as well as innovations so that industries could become slightly better?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. Uh, uh, we've had the incentive because I have dealt a lot with taxation and tax reform. We've had actually a double deduction for R&D for a long time, and I have always supported that. Now, so what is the issue? Remember, I just told you that some of the tech sectors were not even liberalized earlier. So you did not expect a lot of investment in those sectors. So space, telecom, and some of those other sectors were not reformed. And there was no scope for private. So that's another aspect. A third aspect is there's actually now research which shows, I saw this over the last year or so, I don't remember the exact authors, but which showed that if you have controls on parts of the thing so that firms cannot operate flexibly, they do less research. So there's actually a paper which shows that liberalization leads to higher R&D growth. I forget exactly what the definition of liberalization was. I don't want to mislead you, but my vague recollection is that it had to do with labor flexibility, which was a very interesting result. That when there was a natural experiment, I think they compared two different states, one of which had a flexible labor law, and they found that innovation actually increased in that. Now, I'm not saying that that is the way it will happen everywhere, but the liberalization will also promote innovation. Besides that, another element which I'm sure you are very familiar with is the educational system. So, so investment in the upper reaches of education, high tech, etc., that quality of education really the government has to invest. So given all these things, yes, at some point the private businesses also have to come forward and do their part. And certainly if there are efficient incentives which can be provided besides the ones which I've already mentioned, I would definitely support those, yes.
Sir, there is another question from Dr. Ranga Reddy ji.
Sir, see, your presentation is excellently presented, but the thing is corruption and see ethics you have not covered. In India, corruption is going on, see, very openly from panchayats to member of parliaments, and the system is not growing fastly because of corruption. And we have not applied, though say ancient way we are talking about ethics, but we are not following ethics even today in political system. That way we want how to remove in the political system corruption and ethics. Ethics are to be followed. Since centuries we are talking, but we are not implementing ethics. Sir, you clarify these things.
Yeah. So certainly I am not a expert on politics, but let me answer that from the economic angles. I have no disagreement as a citizen on the political aspects you're talking about. But let me say, one of the things I've pointed out, let me give you, I already noted that because of the control regime, the corruption had become systemic. It affected every part of the economy. In fact, I wrote a paper in 2009, which is in EPW, 2000, well before that, it's 2001 paper, where I pointed out this issue of corruption. That's 20 years ago, by the way. It just didn't start now. So, what is it? So the systemic nature has to be addressed through policy reform. But the second aspect, you're right, there is also an element, people again forget that in 2011, a petition was filed before the Supreme Court to set up an SIT on tax evasion, on Swiss bank accounts, etc. And this resulted in the formation of an SIT by SC, Supreme Court, around 2014. And as a result of it, a whole slew of anti-black money laws were passed between 2014 and 19, resulting in demonetization. I'm not a big supporter of demonetization, but the intention really was through this series of changes to attack corruption. But I agree with Professor that perhaps we are not really, and I don't want to speak too much on that because I'm not a political expert, that perhaps the aspects of political reform also is necessary if we want to eliminate this systemic corruption.
Thank you very much, Dr. Virmani ji. Earlier we listened to Dr. Subramaniam ji. I do not know whether Dr. Subramaniam ji is still with us. Dr. Subramaniam ji, I'm not sure whether he is with us or not. Anyway, sir, thank you very much. And this is really an illuminating session wherein we listened to two great speakers. One on policy and investments in the stock market, and the other on the roadmap to growth as far as India is concerned since 1950. Now, Dr. Virmani, you are very, hopeful, and he has been an extremely good lecturer showing that investments in the stock market should be considered as an economic security rather than remaining all the time very much doubtful about the efficiency of the stock markets. Anyway, he has explained his viewpoint and has shown that how the people can earn a lot as far as the stock market is concerned, but the issue is that there are a large number of the cautions. It's not necessary that a stock which is performing quite well, which will perform in future also. There are so many ifs and buts. So anyway, thank you very much, Dr. Subramaniam ji, for your very illuminating lecture. And I hope that the point which you have raised is that we need to educate the people as far as the stock market is concerned. And we need to alleviate their fears as well as the stock market is concerned. The second lecture was by Professor Virmani ji. He has given us a road map of the growth of the economy since 1950, and he has divided it into 5 phases, a nicely drawn 5 phases, and we are very clear about these 5 phases. But the good point is that from a very low growth, 1.3% till 1979, when during this period from 50 to 1979, a period around 30 years, when the poverty actually increased during this period, slowly and steadily poverty declined, economic growth pushed up, but now we have reached a phase where the rate of growth is really